the respiratory system. So why do we breathe? We breathe to exchange gas. All right. Well, obviously, multiple different types of gases. We're obviously going to be focusing on oxygen and carbon dioxide, right? So you inhale oxygen, and you exhale CO2. So why is this gas exchange necessary? Because we need to do cellular respiration. Okay, so this is for cell respiration. It's pretty much when the cells in our body use that oxygen, right? So oxygen comes in to make energy, known as ATP. You should be a master of this concept by now, right? Remember we started with glycolysis, taking that glucose, C6H12O6 here, right? The very simple sugar. Got it from the photosynthesis, right? We ate that plant, so now we have that in our body. We take that oxygen and we use that gas to help break this up, and then we also chew it as well, right? And provided that there is a sufficient amount of oxygen, we can continue from glycolysis to the Krebs cycle. Remember, we got to get that pyruvate from that glucose to eventually turn into acetyl-CoA, right? At acetyl-CoA, we're in Krebs. Okay, so we're now in the process of making more and more and more ATP. That's the goal of cell respiration. And then remember, at the end, we make water, right? Very, very stable. We made that water thanks to the oxygen accepting those last electrons, and it also binds with some hydrogen ions that are floating around, and then we made that water. We also released carbon dioxide in the process. How? Remember in the Krebs cycle, we released a ton of carbons in the form of carbon dioxide. It gets exhaled out of the lungs, out of our oral cavity, and then out into the environment. And then we made ATP at the very end. So what is the function of this respiratory system? We just talked about exchange of gases, right? Exchanging that O2 that came in with that CO2, as exhibited there. But also, the respiratory system defends the body against invasion by microorganisms. For example, why do you have cilia, which is hair in your nose, or even in the trachea where the air goes in when you breathe in? It's to ensure that if there's any foreign particles that shouldn't be there, that mucus builds up, the cilia takes that, right, those organisms that's not supposed to be there, and expels it, whether that's through sneezing or coughing. Produces sound as well. We'll be looking at the voice box in this video. And the last one, it also helps control pH. Okay, specifically about the blood. Because when you have too much CO2, it actually decreases the pH, making it acidic, which is very dangerous. So we got to get rid of that CO2 to establish equilibrium. So now let's track the path of air. Okay, so obviously air is going to go in. Let's start here, all right? The oral cavity, or even up here, the nasal cavity. So this nasal cavity right there, it is hollow, all right? So it's a hollow passageway. And it's lined, like I said, with hair, cilia, so that mucus can be shot out when you are expelling a sneeze and expels foreign particles. So when things like dust or other particles are in there, the mucus builds. Okay, so that one here will be mucus. The mucus builds and ensures that it's not going to go any further. The cilia over there are going to help push this mucus out and again maintain equilibrium. We don't want foreign particles to go in that shouldn't be there. And even if it's very deep, like over here, okay, even below the pharynx, let's say, the cilia sweeps that mucus, okay, this mucus, so let's say it's over here, it sweeps it back up the pharynx, so that it can get out through the nose. Now it also ensures temperature regulation, okay? So I'll also put temperature regulation. All right, remember this, we're talking about the nasal cavity right now, the nasal cavity. Okay, it ensures there's temperature regulation. How? By the capillaries. So the capillaries in the nasal cavity warms up the air. It moistens it. This is why you should always be breathing in through your nose, especially on very, very cold days. You don't want that very, very cold air to be going in through the mouth, right? You want it to go through the nose so that it can regulate that temperature, make it more warmer, so that it can go down the trachea and not cause shock of cold. All right, now let's look at the pharynx. All right, so that air that went through the nose is now going to the trachea. That thing there is the trachea. So I'll just put here, takes air from the nose to the trachea. And this trachea branches off into different parts here, this structure, right? The bronchus and another bronchus, or the bronchi, they break off into even smaller branches over there, like the bronchioles, and then they get even smaller in the alveoli, and within the alveoli there are capillaries as well. And then that's where the final actual exchange of gas occurs. So again, within these alveoli over there are capillaries obviously embedded on the inside for the exchange. Now the pharynx over here that we're just talking about, it also ensures any food that goes in through the mouth over here. Okay, so let's say this is some food, right? The bolus that we have over there can go into the esophagus. All right, I know the esophagus isn't drawn over here, okay, but obviously we don't want the food to go into here. Okay, that would be a big problem. Same thing with the water, we don't want it to go down here. That's when you cough, right? Like you drink too quickly, for example, and it goes down the wrong pipe. It's because it went down the trachea. We don't want that. We want it to go down the esophagus. Again, it's not drawn here, but let's say there's an esophagus. Food's got to go to that esophagus and then eventually into that stomach, okay? You should be a pro by now regarding the digestive system. All right, so I'll just put here, also takes food from mouth to the esophagus. And by the way, the lymphatic system is all around the body. I think particularly in certain areas like the armpits, the groin, and the throat. Okay, so in particular the pharynx. Okay, it's actually another site where a lot of the immune defense tissues, right, that are part of the lymphatic system live there. So I'll just put some immune defense lymph tissues from the lymphatic system live here. All right, again, when you swallow the food, right? So again, we're talking about the epiglottis right now. When you swallow the food, you don't want it to go down the trachea, right? That's bad. So, see that thing, that's the epiglottis. It helps cover, right? And moves and covers in that direction to ensure that this food goes not in there, but it actually goes into the esophagus, wherever that esophagus is, okay? So it covers the trachea when you swallow food, right? So it covers the trachea when ingesting food. Now, while I'm on the topic of epiglottis, I also want to bring in the larynx here, because the larynx sits literally right below the epiglottis. So if that's the epiglottis, let's say this here would be the larynx. You see that triangular looking shape, okay? So we're gonna decide, so we're gonna say this is the larynx. It's in the exact right place. And the larynx literally sits right on top of the trachea. Obviously, this is the trachea over here, right? So this here would be the larynx. So the larynx is known as the voice box. All right, it's made of thin cartilage, which vibrates, okay? So the thin cartilage vibrates, making noise. All right, to make make some sound. I mean, technically the vocal cords within the larynx, but we sometimes use them synonymously. So again, this is the trachea, right? So the air comes up, passes through that thin cartilage, out of the oral cavity, producing that noise thanks to the vibration. And this larynx grows very, very quickly, especially at a young age, especially for men, young men. The growth of the larynx changes the voice. Obviously, it makes it a lot lower. And the trachea, right over there, is known as the windpipe. All right, a lot of people think that the larynx, that voice box, is the Adam's apple, but it's not. This thing over here, this big thing, right? That is actually still part of the trachea. That is the Adam's apple. All right, so maybe I'll just put that here, the Adam's apple. All right, the trachea, also like the larynx, is thin cartilage. So I'll just put here thin cartilage. That takes that air, right? Remember that air came from the pharynx? Okay, whether it was from the mouth or whether it was from the nose, regardless, from the pharynx, that air comes in and the trachea helps it pass through. To where? To the bronchi, right? So that's a bronchi, so that's a bronchus and that's a bronchus. Right, so these bronchi continue to push that air through. All right, so to allow air from pharynx to the bronchi. And like I said, it has cilia as well, right? So there's lots of cilias to ensure that no foreign particles are coming through. We got to eject it then. And another reason why it's cartilage, so it's very strong, is to make sure that it doesn't collapse. So if there's inflammation, what if it starts to swell, right? That's a problem. Then you can't breathe and you'll die. That's why it is strong cartilage. All right, looking at the lungs, so obviously these here are the lungs. The bronchi and its bronchioles have now attached to this lung, all right? This one here, this whole lung, right? It's very spongy, and it has air-filled sacs. All right, there are 3 lobes. I know you can't really see it here very well, but there are 3 lobes. There's 3 on the right here. Okay, so there's 3 lobes here and only 2 here. Okay, so 3 lobes on the right lung and 2 lobes on the left lung. Probably due to the heart. Okay, so obviously the heart is a little bit more on the left side, so because it needs more space, that's probably why there's only 2 lobes. And then the bronchi. Let's look at the bronchi now. So these bronchi come from the trachea, all right? So they're from the trachea. They branch out from the trachea, I mean, in order to lead to these lungs. And leads to the lung. And guess what? They also have a ton of cilia. Okay, so there's a lot of cilia here too. All right, so also has cilia. Also has cilia. All right, like the trachea and the nasal cavity. And obviously these are the bronchioles, all right? They're just subdivisions, smaller subdivisions of the bronchi. Let's focus here on the alveoli, okay? So bronchioles into the alveoli. Let's put it up here, the alveoli. These finally allow gas exchange, like I mentioned earlier, with the carbon dioxide and the O2. All right, so the O2 goes into blood. So this kind of looks like a CO2. Okay, right there, that's an O2. Okay, so the O2 is into the blood, while CO2 diffuses out. And there's a lot. There's like hundreds of millions of alveoli over here. Also, the alveoli has to be moist. Okay, so the membranes that the alveoli is made of has to be moist to assist diffusion. This is why a lot of the amphibians, they live in both aquatic and land environments, because when they're on land environment, their lungs can get quite dry. So they got to be near water to ensure that it remains moistened. All right, so gas exchange, again, occurs by diffusion based on concentration. Okay, so this here means concentration. Okay, so again, diffusion is the movement of particles from high to low, right? So movement of particles from high concentration to low concentration. If there is a high concentration of oxygen up here that you've literally just breathed in, where is all of that going to go? It's going to go into the alveoli, right? And then in the alveoli, it has capillaries over here, right? So let's put like capillaries. It goes through the capillary and then finally into the blood. A lot of the CO2 in that blood also flows through that capillary and then makes its way back out, and then you breathe it out. Again, because CO2 is always being released, right? Cellular respiration produces CO2, so as the cells are working in every single muscle around the body in all different places, CO2 keeps being released. It continues to accumulate, so it's got to go somewhere. It's got to get out. That's what's happening here. Because obviously there's a low concentration of CO2 here. Same thing here, low concentration of CO2. All right, let's take a brief glance at this exchange, okay? Just zoomed in more just to help you with your understanding. So let's say this here is the capillary wall, all right? So capillary wall. And then on the inside here is your vessel, right? But obviously within the inside here, there's a lot of plasma floating around. Okay, most of it is water, right? With dissolved gases and nutrients, hormones, etc. And floating around in there are some blood cells. So there's going to be CO2 everywhere, even within the cells, right? Because cells do the cellular respiration. It produces the CO2. So let's say we have some CO2s flowing around. Okay, in here, oops, in here, in here. There's also CO2s on the outside as well in the plasma. They got to get out. What's this thing here? This will be the alveoli wall. Or let's say this is the actual alveoli, right? And then outside of that is going to be the bronchioles, the bronchi, etc. So oxygen, so a lot of oxygen are here, right? High concentration of oxygen. Okay, so the oxygen are now going to go finally into the cell, all right? Well, I forgot to write a capillary, okay, because it's got to go through the capillary, right? So we have this alveoli wall. So we have capillary down here. I didn't put one here, so let's put another capillary right here. All right, so again, this is also another capillary. All right, so it crosses that capillary, is able to go in, okay, and then this CO2 has got to go out. There's a big reaction that happens in here. Like, how do we know that this CO2 is creating a very acidic environment? What reaction is going on? Well, CO2 is obviously going to be mixed with some water as well, right? Water is everywhere. When you have too much CO2 and water, what ends up happening? I'll show you that down here. So we got CO2 and water. It produces H2CO3. This is known as carbonic acid. Okay, so obviously it's an acid based on its name. This just means like this is an arrow. Okay, another arrow is going backwards because this is reversible. Okay, so it can go this way and it can go this way. It is acidic because this acid, if it continues to go in that direction, so let's say over here, it produces H plus and bicarbonate, HCO3. This is a polyatomic ion as well, right? The definition of an acid, well, one of the definitions of an acid is a release of hydrogens. When you have an increase of H pluses, this is going to create an acidic environment. So the more CO2s you have, more acids you get, and then the more H pluses that are increasing, being yielded, creating an acidic environment. Dangerous. So there is some buffers that go on to ensure that this continues and be plentiful in amounts, because if you have an increase On this side, it's going to drive the reaction towards the left in the opposite direction. Then we can expel the CO2 out. You don't need to know too much about this though. This goes into Le Chatelier's principle. If you want to know more about that, there's a video link in the description, but you don't need to know about it right now. Just know that this type of reaction is going here on the inside, okay? We got to get rid of that CO2 out while we get the oxygen in. And a lot of the oxygens we want to be packed in each of these cells, and it can, thanks to the hemoglobin. Remember? The irons, right? We have iron on the insides, right? They can bind onto the oxygens so that it super saturates this with as much oxygen as possible so that we can transport those oxygens to different places around the body. And like I said before, carbon dioxide can also be transported in the red blood cells here. Okay, so 75% of CO2 is actually traveled this way. Only like 25% actually just travel in the plasma. But like nearly all the oxygen, like close to 100%, they all travel on the actual red blood cell from the hemoglobin protein. Okay, so looking back at the lung here, there's a pleura. Okay, it's like a membrane on the very, very outsides. It's two-layered. So I'll put here pleura. It's two-layered to prevent friction from occurring, okay, between the lungs and others. Okay, so that it can move freely in the chest cavity, right, to move freely. All right, so now let's look at the diaphragm. So we see the diaphragm over here. It's on the bottom. It is a thin layer of muscle. Okay, and it's at the bottom of the rib cage. You can't see the rib cage over here, but it's somewhere here. Okay, so it's below that, below ribs. All right, and it moves up and down based on the volume of this thoracic cavity and the rib cage. We'll look at that shortly in this video. So there are different stages of respiration. All right, the first one is known as ventilation or breathing. All right, so this is literally inhaling or exhaling. So this is the most superficial. The next one would have to be external, so ext, okay, ext, external respiration. Right, this is the exchange of gas between the alveoli and the blood. Okay, so we're getting a little bit deeper now, but then we have internal respiration. Okay, this is respiration. It's also the exchange of gas, but now it's between not alveoli and blood, but now it's between the blood, so between blood and the actual cells that require that oxygen. And that fourth one sounds a lot more familiar to you, okay? Cellular respiration. This occurs in the mitochondria, right? So occurs in mitochondria. To let the oxygen break down, to catabolize that glucose, that sugar, that valuable sugar, and in order to make ATP, right? Obviously, there's other things that get produced on the side here, right? Like the waters, like the waters and the CO2s, right? So don't forget about those. Now, there are also non-respiratory air movements. So for example, coughing. When you cough, it's to clear the lower respiratory tract, right? So to clear respiratory tract. All right, the epiglottis opens and then the air just literally goes through, and then to remove any foreign particles, for example. A sneeze, though, also acts to clear the respiratory tract, all right? But obviously a sneeze aims to clear the upper respiratory tract, right? Obviously, like the nose kind of area, the nasal cavity. So I'll just put here the upper. all right, the upper tract. And then obviously the cough will be on the lower tract, right, like down the oral cavity area, so lower area. Hiccups results from the spasm in the diaphragm, right, that layer of muscle below the rib cage, right? This causes sudden inhalation, and it's hard to get rid of. And obviously, you know what makes that noise, right? The sound every time a spasm does occur. It's when that air goes through that vocal cord within the larynx, right? And then we have yawn. This is not just a sudden small inhalation. This is a very, very deep inspiration. So very deep inhalation, right? What does it do? It obviously increases your oxygen in blood. So in primitive times, it would be very dangerous for you to be very sleepy because this puts you in a vulnerable position of being attacked from predators, right? Maybe even other people. So to ensure that you have a sufficient amount of oxygen going into your body so that you can fight or flight and you're ready for that, that deep inhalation saturates your muscles with the amount of oxygen necessary so that you can produce a ton of force from those muscles, again, to either run away or fight. Why is it contagious? Because if you see another person do that, you want to ensure that they are woken up to not fall asleep, okay? And then if you do that because it's contagious, someone else might yawn as well, and then it becomes like a chain reaction to ensure that everyone knows to help wake each other up. All right, what are some requirements? As said before, it must be moist, okay? So the respiratory surface must be moist. So like I said, water organisms have no problem keeping wet, right? But air-breathing organisms like us need to have a secretion of liquid over the respiratory surfaces of those different organs, those body parts, right? To prevent dehydration. And having dehydration would obviously be very, very detrimental. The cellular respiration would not occur efficiently. There must also be a difference, so diff for difference, of partial pressure. I'll just put it as P and P, all right? So this is partial pressure on either side of that surface, of the surface that we're talking about in this system. So if I were to like draw a line over here, let's say there's high partial pressure, okay, over here, so lots of gases, but on this side there's very low partial pressure because there's not many gases, okay? Where's it going to go? Which direction? Obviously it's going to go to that side. Now what is partial pressure? It's pretty much just the amount of pressure the individual gases are going to be exerting on the wall. So for example, if you have a container or something here, we have some gases. How much pressure are they exerting against the container? If they were the only gases in this container, so no other gases. So let's say, again, these were oxygens, right? So how much pressure are they exerting on the sides if it was only them? Another one, the respiratory surface must have a large surface area. A small surface area isn't going to be able to do as much gas exchange as a larger surface area would. This one would be a lot more efficient. This is why in our lungs, right, within the alveoli, gills of a salamander or gills of a fish, they all have very, very large surface area. And the last one, obviously, the circulatory system must be connected well and be working well with the respiratory system. They work heavily in conjunction, right? So in order to breathe, so some mechanisms to breathe. partial pressure is key, right? Gases will move from a high partial pressure area to low partial pressure area. So let's say you have a little container here and there's a few gases. Let's say there's oxygen in there. Let's say it's like a 0.4 atm, or this is atmospheric pressure that is being hit on the side of the walls collectively. Okay, if you add that with another gas, but this time on the insides, it's going to be maybe nitrogen gas. Okay, and let's say this time it has like, I don't know, 0.6 atm of pressure on the outside. What's going to be the total? It actually doesn't matter about the type of gas. As long as it's hit at standard atmospheric temperature and pressure, you just add up the total pressures. So if this is 0.4 from this gas and this is 0.6 from this gas, it doesn't matter that this is oxygen and this is nitrogen. You can actually just collectively combine them. So obviously you get 1.0, okay? So again, I'll do it in a different color. Let's say these were the oxygens, and let's say these were the nitrogens, all right? You put them together, it still gives you a sum of 1 atm atmospheric pressure. The greater the partial pressure difference between the two areas, all right, so between this one and this one, right, these are the two gases we're comparing, the more rapid is the diffusion of the gases. So let's look at inhalation. What is particularly happening? So obviously the air is going through. Let's look at this diaphragm. It is moving down. All right, so it moves down. Okay, so diaphragm moves down. All right, it also contracts. So I'll also put here contracts. Why? Because air is coming in. You're going to make more space for that air to come in into this thoracic cavity. So bring this down to make more space. What do you see over here? The intercostal muscles. These are the muscles that get in between the ribs. So you see those. You see those muscles. You can see those striations, right? So those muscles pull the ribs out. Okay, so I'll put intercostal muscles pull the ribs out. All right, so up and out. Same thing with the diaphragm. They are contracting. All right, so they're contracting. So what do you think is going to happen to this whole area, right? This whole chest cavity. So obviously the chest cavity is getting bigger, so it's expanding. So chest cavity expands. All right, so that volume gets way bigger. So volume up. So what do you think is going to happen to the air pressure? We just talked about partial pressure, right? What do you think is going to happen to the air pressure in the lungs? All right, is it going to increase or is it going to decrease? It's going to increase in pressure, okay? But how about just before that air comes in, though? At that point, it's decreased, okay? So I'll put here, initially, the air pressure is low. Why? Because then it's going to allow more air to come in, right? Flowing from high concentration to low concentration. So initially the air pressure is low. So it's going to decrease here in the lungs. But once you inhale, obviously it's going to increase, right? Because initially it's to pull air into the lungs. Right? Based on Dalton's law. And then now let's look at the exhalation. All right, so just going outwards in that direction. All right, so let's look at the diaphragm again. All right, what's happening to the diaphragm? Obviously, it is going up. So it is going to be doing the opposite. It's not contracting, it is relaxing. All right, so diaphragm relaxes. Okay, and goes up. And then we looked at the intercostal muscles, right? So let's look at this intercostal muscle. The intercostal muscle also relaxes. And moves the ribs inwards or down. In and down. So what's going to happen to this whole chest cavity? Obviously, it's going to decrease. So chest cavity decreases. All right, so the volume gets way smaller. So now let's look at the pressure. What was it initially? Initially, the air pressure was very, very high. Right, so initially, air pressure was high. So when you exhale, that will eventually become very low. But initially, why was the pressure high? To allow air to get out.